Well, it's time to begin. And so I'd like to welcome our distinguished guests here tonight, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael O'Neill. I'm from Vose Seminary, and I'm your MC for tonight's event, but you've not come to listen to me, so I'll try to be quite brief. Is everyone seated? That being the case, it's my pleasure now to introduce or worship the Mayor of the City of South Perth, Sue Doherty, to open tonight's proceedings. Let's welcome Mayor Doherty tonight.
Thanks, Michael. Good evening, and on behalf of the City of South Perth, I extend a very warm welcome to everyone here tonight who's come along to listen to what, in my view, promises to be an interesting dialogue about the Bible and science. I acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional custodians of this country and its waters. I wish to pay respect to their elders past and present. All Australians are enriched by the wisdom, enduring history and culture of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Theirs is the oldest of the many stories that make up our country. The City of South Perth has an area of 1,983 hectares. It's a distance of 4 kilometres from the CBD and has a population of 46,113 people and is surrounded by the Swan River to the north and to the west and the Canning River in the south. We are a city that has 13 churches, and I acknowledge the value of Christians to our community. For someone new to our city, they might well ask, well, every community has a number of churches. What is it that's so significant about churches? Indeed, what is significant from my perspective is the contribution Christians make to our community and what they bring in terms of part of a dialogue or a discussion about Christianity. I digress for a moment. One component of any discourse about religion frequently refers to faith. For me, faith is an integral part of my life. In my role as Mayor, I'm a leader of a community undergoing a tsunami of change imposed on all metropolitan local governments by our state government. I am reminded every day of my faith. In fact, quirky as it may seem, I have sitting above me in my office 3 bottles of St. Helet's Faith Shiraz. Symbols for me of the faith, they're all full, I need each and every day in both my life, personally and professionally. Interestingly, they initiate conversations with many visitors in my office, a Christian dialogue about faith. The churches in our city cut above their weight in their contribution to our community. For many, though, what they give is, I feel, taken for granted. We have childcare centres attached to 3 churches, offering valuable services to families, counselling services provided to youth, drop-in facilities for young people, and group opportunities for seniors to gather. Additionally, a not-for-profit organisation, Southcare, of which I'm a board member, was established as an initiative of one of our local churches. It provides home and community care, a community visitor scheme, financial counselling and advocacy, emergency relief and referral, Aboriginal family support, both a low-cost food store and an opportunity store. As each and every one of us have our own life story and relationship with Christianity, I look forward to listening to guest speakers Dr. Hugh Ross and Dr. Carl Wieland share their views and stories through their dialogue. Finally, I'd actually like to thank Mr. Michael McCleary, Betty Skinner and the Reverend Ian Robinson for inviting me to be present this evening, and welcome to you all to the City of South Perth.
Thank you very much, Sue. I just wanted to give you this small token of our thanks on behalf of everybody here, and in particular on behalf of Reasons to Believe. Thank you so much for your support.
Thank you, Mayor Doherty. Again, welcome and thank you for your interest in attendance of this event Our proceedings tonight are hosted by the first chapter of Reasons to Believe, who are delighted that not only Dr. Hugh Ross is here in Perth, but also that Dr. Carl Wieland has changed his schedule in order to join us for this dialogue tonight. The issue of creation is of fundamental importance if we're to understand the Christian faith and to formulate a Christian worldview. Further, the intersection of faith and science is a vibrant field of serious investigation, reflection, discussion, and ongoing public interest. It's simply not the case that all scientists bear the image of, say, for example, Richard Dawkins. Many distinguished scientists are making very valuable contributions in their field as deeply committed Christians. To be a Christian, however, does not mean that we all think alike. And this is especially the case when we consider beginnings and endings, creation and the world to come. Scripture has much to say about these fields of knowledge and is open to various interpretations. Throw in the discoveries of science, working hypotheses, philosophies of life and the universe, and the field is set for passionate discussion, if not outright disagreement. And this is just inside the church. So let me introduce our guests tonight. Dr. Hugh Ross and Dr. Carl Wieland both lead worldwide organisations that address areas of science and biblical faith. Even though they agree on many core elements of biblical teaching, there are some points, especially concerning the relationship of Bible and science, the age of the earth and Noah's flood, where they may differ. Dr. Wieland represents Creation Ministries International, who view the earth as young in age, whereas Dr. Ross represents Reasons to Believe, who hold the view that the earth is actually quite old. Young earth and old earth views have been somewhat contentious within the Christian community. Discussions have often generated more heat than light. We're quite privileged tonight, I think, for the first time ever. These leading authorities on the two views are meeting here in Perth for a public dialogue and a period of Q&A. The organisers have called this a gracious dialogue, and so I would underline that it's not actually a debate. We're not seeking to crown somebody as a winner at the end of this evening. Rather, our hope tonight is that we will listen carefully and closely to the presentations and leave here with an increased understanding of the various perspectives so that we're able to come to an informed decision regarding our own position with respect to these issues. Dr. Hugh Ross is an astronomer, author of many books and spoken internationally, universities and science organisations and churches on the relationship between science and faith. He is the founder and president of Reasons to Believe, which is located in Los Angeles in California. Dr. Carl Wieland began his career as a medical doctor and practiced as a surgeon before taking a leading role in creation science organisations. He is the managing director of Creation Ministries International, which is based in Brisbane and also has offices in a number of countries, including the United States and the United Kingdom. He also lectures internationally as the author of numerous articles and a number of books. Both authors actually have books available afterwards, and they have indicated they'd be pleased if you'd like to purchase one of their books. They'd be very pleased to sign it afterwards. How will the evening proceed? In a moment, I'm going to ask Dr. Ross to speak first for about 30 or 35 minutes, presenting his viewpoint, and then after that, Carl will speak for 30 to 35 minutes, presenting his viewpoint. If time is allowing, then we'll have a little bit of opportunity for Dr. Ross and Dr. Wieland to ask each other a couple of questions. And after that, we'll have some time for questions from the audience. Now, the way the organisers have arranged this evening is they put up phone numbers all the way around the hall, 0479 146 326. If you have a question that's burning away during the evening, please text it, and it will be collected and collated by some helpers at the back, who will then provide me with a list of questions to ask towards the end of the evening. So please do not call out questions from the floor. This is our way of trying to ensure that our questions are going to be relevant and they're going to be timely and so forth. At the end of the evening, I'll make a few closing comments, and I'll also ask for a gold coin donation. Of course, if you want to give more than a gold coin, I'm sure the organisers would be very pleased indeed. There's actually quite a lot of expenses involved in preparing this evening, and your help is very much appreciated. So, Dr. Ross, I invite you to the lectern. Let's welcome Dr.
Well, thank you. And Reasons to Believe is an organization I founded some 28 years ago, and we're developing new evidences from the frontiers of scientific research to put your faith in Jesus Christ as Creator, Lord, and Savior. But the dialogue tonight is about the universe and the earth. Are they old or are they young? And I'm going to begin first with what the Bible says about the age of the earth. And one point that Carl and I would agree on is that all humans are descended from Adam and Eve, whom God specially created only tens of thousands of years ago. So we don't dispute the time when Adam and Eve and all of humanity came about. We'll both take a young perspective on that. And all Hebrew scholars agree that the literal definition for yom, day in Genesis 1, includes a long but finite period of time. That word yom has 4 different literal definitions. Part of the daylight hours, all of the daylight hours, a 24-hour period, or a long but finite period of time. Also, all Hebrew scholars agree that yom is the only word in biblical Hebrew that can be defined as a long period of time. In English, we got a dozen different words for an epoch of time. In biblical Hebrew, the only word is yom. So this debate is not between a literal and a figurative interpretation of Genesis 1. It's a choice between 2 different literal interpretations of these days of creation. But one reason I'm persuaded that the Bible teaches that these days must be long periods of time and not 24 hours is all these passages in the Bible that tell us the laws of physics do not change. Jeremiah 33:25, God speaks and says, I've established the fixed laws of heaven and earth. Read the entire chapter. God says, you change, but I don't change. As proof that I don't change, look at the laws of physics. In astronomy, we've looked at galaxies and quasars billions of light years away. It's the same laws of physics billions of years ago as we see in the present era. Now, this is significant because that means that the Bible rules out the young earth doctrine that God radically altered the laws of physics at the fall of Adam or at the flood or both. And all young earth models are critically dependent on radically altered laws of physics. So the Bible itself rules out that possibility. The thing I noticed the first time I picked up a Bible at age 17 is when you look at Genesis 1, each of the first 6 days is bracketed by an evening and a morning, but there is no evening and morning for the 7th day, which implies that we're still in the 7th day, and that's actually taught in 3 different passages. Psalm 95, John 5, and Hebrews 4 all tell us we're still in God's 7th creation day. And that's a day that will not end until the full number of people receive redemption has been reached, Romans 8, verse 23. And it's a day when God conquers and removes evil, and clearly evil is still here. The thing you notice in Genesis 2:4 is that this word yom is used to refer to the entire creation week. So even within the context of Genesis, we see this word clearly refers to a long period of time. The other thing you notice is that on the 6th day, God creates both the human male and the human female. That's Genesis 1, but notice what it says in Genesis chapter 2. God creates Adam first, and he creates him outside the Garden of Eden. He's able to watch the trees in the garden grow, and of course it takes time for trees to grow. He tends the garden, I believe long enough to realize there's more to life than gardening. Then God has him name all the soulish animals. All of those creatures that can be tamed by human beings, those creatures that God designs to serve and please human beings, each in their own specific way. So after having named all the animals for how God designed them to relate to him, we notice that God looks at Adam and recognizes that he is alone. it takes time to experience loneliness. God puts him to sleep. He recovers from some surgery that God performs on him, and then he sees his new creature, Eve. And what does he say when he sees Eve? Well, the word that we see in the Hebrew original is hapa'am, used more than 20 times in the Old Testament and consistently translated at long last. Therefore, the sixth day, just like the seventh day, must be a long period of time, and the grammatical structure in Genesis 1 would tell you, therefore, all the days are long periods of time. So I hold the position that God creates miraculously, instantaneously, millions of times throughout 6 consecutive long creation periods. And it was this particular biblical evidence that convinced Isaac Newton and his contemporaries that the universe and the earth were old. This is what he said concerning Genesis 1. Now for ye number and length of ye 6 days, by what is said above, you may make ye first day as long as you please, and ye second day as well. This is significant because he was the first public figure to take an unambiguous stand on the earth's age based on what the Bible taught, and this was 180 years before Darwin's theory was even proposed. So in that sense, you can't say that the old earth view was in the context of a Darwinian evolution before Darwinian evolution was even proposed. And incidentally, as an astronomer, I can tell you this. When we realized the universe was only billions of years old, we recognized Darwinian evolution is done. Astronomers were really trying to make the universe quadrillions of years old in order to allow enough time for the Darwinian paradigm. Whatever illusions the biologists had, the astronomers knew if it's only billions of years, it's impossible to sustain a Darwinian interpretation of life. Now, God has given us 2 books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature. Ours is a ministry that uses the book of nature to bring people to the book of Scripture. And so I'll spend the remainder of my time on what the book of nature has to say about the age of the universe. And this is a place, again, where there's considerable agreement. Both of our ministries agree that the universe has expanded from a space-time beginning, that the Bible teaches that the universe has a beginning that includes a beginning of space and time, and how the universe has expanded from that beginning. 6 different Bible authors speak about the expansion of the universe. And we can see that the universe has expanded, literally by how much? By looking at Hubble Space Telescope photos of distant galaxies. So images like the following tell us by how much the universe has expanded. We can see a time when the galaxies were jammed very tightly together, so tightly together they're tearing spiral arms off of one another, and today the universe has expanded to a very large extent. This allows us to develop a very straightforward determination of the age of the universe. Since the universe began very small, the age of the cosmos is simply the present size of the universe divided by the expansion rate. So simply measuring the expansion rate of the universe gives us a straightforward determination of the age of the universe, and astronomers possess a continuous record of cosmic expansion over 13 billion light years. All these measures establish that the universe is about 14 billion years old. There really is no debate on this issue. Or another way to look at it, if the universe expands from its space-time beginning, and it expands over a period of less than 1 million years, then that means that gravity would never be able to collect gas to make galaxies, stars, and planets. It would be 100% diffuse gas. So in a young universe model, there should be no stars, galaxies, or planets. Now, if the universe is more than a quadrillion years old, then the universe would be expanding so slowly that gravity will take all that gas and convert 100% of it into black holes and neutron stars. Now, if you want galaxies, stars, and planets, only if the universe is about 14 billion years old are you going to get sun-like stars and Earth-like planets. So this debate can be settled with a simple question. Do you believe in the existence of planets? Now, another way we can measure the age of the universe is take what the Bible says. The Bible says the universe has a space-time beginning, expands from that beginning under laws of physics that don't change, where one of those laws is a pervasive law of decay. which allows us to develop a biblically predicted cooling curve for the universe. And what you see in that graph up there is the cooling curve, presuming that the universe is 13.8 billion years old. You'll get different cooling curves for different ages. But there's a cooling curve with a presumption of 13.8 billion years, and what you see are actual measurements that astronomers have made of the past temperature of the universe, and notice that it perfectly fits the curve on the assumption that the universe is 13.8 billion years. Now, light travel time is a big issue of debate between young Earth and old Earth creationists. Light from galaxies billions of light years away must take billions of years to reach Earth if indeed the velocity of light is constant and the distances that we astronomers are real. There is no dispute about the distances, but young universe creationists have come up with several solutions, but really it boils down to just three. These are the three that remain today. One is the presumption that light traveled 1 million times faster in the past than it did today, and therefore light could get here 1 million times faster. Another is that distant clocks run 1 million times faster than they do here on Earth, and that light travels faster towards the Earth than it does away from the Earth. Let me go through these one at a time. What about a faster light speed? Well, I found no matter where I speak, everybody knows one equation of physics, E equals mc squared. And E refers to the energy, m the mass, and c the velocity of light, which implies if light's velocity was 1 million times faster for Adam than it was for us, then the energy coming out of the sun and the stars would be 1 trillion times brighter, 1 trillion times more light and heat. And so one reason why that is not possible is that the sun did not vaporize the earth at the time of Adam and Eve. The Bible is quite clear. The earth survived at that particular point. And another reason to support that is that we astronomers look at these hyperfine split lines in galaxies. They're spectral lines, but the degree of splitting depends on the velocity of light. And no matter how far away we look, no matter how far back in time we see, this velocity of light measures to be identical to what we see in the laboratory. And incidentally, life would be impossible if the velocity of light had changed any time in history. So that means that there's no possible change in the velocity of light. What about clocks? There's a presumption in the young Earth community that perhaps clocks in distant galaxies run 1 million times faster than they do here on Earth. Well, the universe is actually filled with clocks. All over the universe we see clocks. Cepheid variable stars, supernova are probably the ones we see at the greatest distance. What's a supernova? It's a star that undergoes an explosion that for a time outshines the light of an entire galaxy. Therefore, we can see it at great distances. Here's the supernova 1994D that showed up for a period of several months very brightly and then gradually began to dim, which means we have what's called a supernova clock, where we see the light of the star getting extremely bright over a period of a few weeks, and then it takes a few months to die down. But this allows us to develop a test for the age of the universe. In this sense, if the universe is 1 quadrillion years old or older, then the clock would take the same amount of time to run in a distant galaxy as it does in our own galaxy, namely about 7 months. But if we're talking a universe that's about 14 billion years old, then that means there'd be sufficient expansion velocity that we would get a little bit of time dilation. And therefore, we'd actually expect that the clocks would run slower slightly in distant galaxies. Namely, we'd be predicting 9 months. And if it's a young Earth model where the universe is less than 10,000 years old, it would be just 18 seconds. So we can look at these distant supernovae, and the answer we get is 9 months. So the universe is not very old, it's not very young, it's middle age. You can refer to me as a middle-aged creationist. And then the newest attempt to try to claim that light can get here quickly is to say, well, maybe light travels at an infinite velocity towards Earth and half the velocity of light away from Earth, based on the fact that we physicists can only measure the return of the velocity of light. We can't measure the one way. So we presume it's the same both ways. Now, what's happening in the young Earth community is they're assuming that the velocity of light is infinite towards Earth from all directions. Well, the truth is the isotropy of light's velocity is a convention, but not its directionality. Directionality that focuses on Earth would actually generate a geocentric gravitational field independent of Earth's mass. And we don't measure any such gravitational field. The lack of the field proves that light's velocity can't be radically different away from Earth as it is towards Earth. And in all of these models, the prediction in the young Earth community is that when we make astronomical measurements, everything we measure will have an age of 10,000 years or less. And the truth is, we astronomers see many stars and gaseous nebulae that measure to be less than 10,000 years old. We see many that measure to be millions of years old, and many that measure to be billions of years old, which would imply that we live in a universe where stars and galaxies are continuing to form over the period of 14 billion years. Bottom line, there is no young universe solution to the light travel time problem. And when I've debated young universe astronomers, they admit that indeed is correct. There is no young universe solution to this problem. And this is not just a tough problem, it's catastrophic to all young universe models. Now the retort is this, that it's not just young universe creationists that have a problem, old Earth creationists also have a problem. And the problem is this, if the universe is only 14 billion years old, that's not enough time for the universe to remain thermally connected. And it measures to be thermally connected. But that presumption assumes that the universe has been expanding at the same rate throughout the history of the universe. In fact, what's happened in Big Bang cosmology is we recognize that the universe has a very early hyperinflation event. Very brief, but it's where the universe literally expands millions of times faster than the velocity of light. So our light travel time problem is resolved if indeed there is an early inflationary epoch in the history of the universe. And particle physics actually demands that there be such an event. But it turns out there's a test. I mean, what you see in the young Earth literature, there's no way to prove this right or wrong. That's actually not correct. There is a way to prove whether or not this inflation event took place, and that's looking carefully at the polarization signal in the cosmic background radiation, the radiation left over from the cosmic creation event. If there is no inflation, a term called the spectral index, the secular spectral index, will measure to be greater than 1.0. If it's simple inflation, it'll be 0.95. And if it's complex inflation, it'll be between 0.96 and 0.97. And two instruments have already detected this scalar spectral index. The WMAP satellite, measuring the cosmic background radiation after 9 years of data collection, showed that the value was 0.9608 plus or minus 0.0080. And recently, the Planck satellite demonstrated that the value is 0.9600 plus or minus 0.0073. In all likelihood, this will probably win the Nobel Prize for establishing indeed an inflationary event happened. And by the way, only in an inflationary universe is human life possible. Then there's stellar aging. The universe is filled with burnt out stars, stars that have burnt all their fuel. Stars like white dwarfs, neutron stars, black holes. And the burnout times for white dwarfs are in the billions of years. And not only do we see burnt out stars, we see these burnt out stars cooling. Kind of what happens when you have a fire. The coals exhaust all the fuel, but you notice it takes time for those embers to cool down and go from red to black. Well, likewise, we astronomers measure the cooling sequences of these white dwarfs, which not only shows that the white dwarfs are burnt out, where they've exhausted all their fuel, but that they've actually been cooling down for many billions of years. Now, this is simply based on straightforward thermodynamic cooling. The only assumption that goes into this is that the universe possesses the thermodynamic history that's critical to make life possible. So all of you here are living proof that indeed the cooling sequences of white dwarfs establish that the universe is billions of years old. A quick word about radiometric decay. If the universe indeed is less than 10,000 years of age, we would expect to see in both the sun and the earth not only long-lived radiometric elements like uranium and thorium, which have half-lives of billions of years, we'd also expect to see plutonium, neptunium, and technetium, which have half-lives that are only a few million years. Now, if we were to see a universe that was more than 10 quadrillion years of age, we would expect to see no radiometric elements at all in either the sun or the earth. All the uranium and thorium would have decayed away. But if the universe is 14 billion years of age, then we'd expect to see neither neptunium, plutonium, or technetium in either the sun or the earth, but we'd expect to see lots of remaining uranium and thorium. And that's exactly what we see. There is no technetium or neptunium or plutonium in the earth or the sun or any of the solar system planets, but there's still a good amount of both uranium and thorium. And we can measure the amounts very precisely and establishes that indeed we live in a universe that's 13.8 billion years of age. Now there is a retort to this in the young Earth community, and that's to claim that the laws of physics change radically at the fall of Adam or at the flood or both, and in particular that the radiometric decay rates change. In fact, a consortium of young Earth organizations formed a group called the Rate Projects. And what they mention in the Rate Project, if there is no change in the radiometric decay rates, then indeed both the Earth and the universe must be billions of years old. But they're insistent that indeed those laws have changed, in particular the decay rates. But what we see is that we can see xenon isotopes. Xenon is not radiometric, but xenon comes from the radiometric decay of uranium and plutonium. And you get a different ratio of xenon isotopes for plutonium than you do for uranium. And we see in the crust of the Earth is a signature that tells us plutonium indeed was present on the early Earth. And moreover, that the decay rates of plutonium were the same back then as they are today. So this is one of many evidences that establish that the decay rates have not changed over the history of the Earth or the universe. And one way we can demonstrate that up close is look at ice cores. And there are 4 deep ice cores that have been drilled in northern Greenland and 3 in central Antarctica. And in particular, Dome C in Antarctica shows 800,000 annual layers. Now, we know the layers must be annual because they reveal known volcanic eruptions. Each volcanic eruption has its own unique dust signature, and we see the dust signatures of these volcanic eruptions in the layers of ice in Antarctica and Greenland. We also see 8 cycles of the variation in the eccentricity of Earth's orbit. Earth's orbit has a particular shape, but the shape varies over a period of 100,000 years. So for example, as you look at these deep ice cores, we can see the signature of the Vesuvius eruption and the Krakatoa eruption, count the number of layers in between, and it's exactly equal to what we see in our historical calendars. Namely, that these layers really are annual layers. And in the deepest one, we can see 8 cycles of the variation in the eccentricity of Earth's orbit. We also can see radiometric isotopes in these layers, so this gives us an independent way of establishing that there's been no change in the decay rates over the past 800,000 years. And all 7 of these deep ice cores yield the identical result that the Earth must be much older than 100,000 years. Now, there is a rebuttal from the young Earth community. What they say is that there is a plane accident that took place in southern Greenland where we see many layers per year, but that's southern Greenland. It's close to the ocean, where indeed you do get melts during the winter, but that does not happen either in Antarctica or in northern Greenland, where you got thousands of feet of thickness of ice. And with no exception, every reliable scientific measuring tool gives results consistent with a 14 billion year cosmos, which is why in a Supreme Court hearing on creation evolution, there were physicists that came forward and said it would literally be easier scientifically to defend a flat Earth than it would be to defend an old Earth. And this is actually recognized by the leaders of young Earth creationist organizations. For example, I was involved in a radio debate on America's largest Christian radio program, KKLA Live. And the host, Jon Stewart, asked this question of the person I was debating, namely the president of the Institute for Creation Research, John Morris. He said, "Do you know any scientist who concludes apart from a particular Bible interpretation that the universe or earth is young?" And he said, quite honestly, "No, I don't know of a single scientist who falls into that category." I was also in a similar debate with Dwayne Gish, the vice president of the Institute for Creation Research, and Jon Stewart asked the same question. Do you know any scientist who concludes apart from a particular Bible interpretation that the universe or the earth is young? And he also said, in the 50 years of my ministry, I don't know of a single one that falls into that category. What does that mean? There is no scientific evidence for a young earth. What's driving this is a particular Bible interpretation. Now, this is a short debate. Each of us has 30 minutes to make our case, but I did participate in quite a lengthy debate on this subject, and it was with the young universe astronomer Danny Faulkner. So it was a several-hour debate, and it was actually broadcast nationally on television in the United States. And you can actually get the DVD. We don't have it at the back, but you can get it from Reasons to Believe. The entire televised debate is available. So if you want to go into this in more depth, you can get that. But we actually did the debate in the spirit of Acts 15, where the church was divided over whether or not you had to be circumcised in order to be a Christian. And this is a debate with Paul and the circumcision party, but it was adjudicated by the Jerusalem elders. And so Danny and I agreed to have this debate adjudicated by a panel of 13 evangelical astronomers that both of us agreed would be fair in being able to evaluate our debate. And they wound up writing a 41-page evaluation of the debate, and we said the Jerusalem Council boiled it down to 2 sentences. See if you guys can edit it, guys and gals, down to 1 page. And this is the page they produced. Of course, I don't expect you to be able to read this, but you can get this on our website at reasons.org. You can get the entire statement from the 13 astronomers. And if you want to actually get into this in more depth, we've just released this book, Navigating Genesis. It's at the back there. And I also wrote an entire book on the age of the earth called A Matter of Days. And also you'll see a number of debates on our website where you get it completely unedited. We never alter the debate. You get to see it exactly as it is. And I managed to end my talk in 26 minutes, so I think you got enough time, so we'll be all done in 1 hour. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Ross. Dr. Carl Wieland.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to say what a great idea this is, and I thank particularly Mike McCleary, who's been a real pleasure to work with. You know, in contemplating this first 30 minutes, I thought that Hugh and I probably face similar issues in, you know, how do we best summarize things to defend and proclaim the respective positions that we hold and perhaps even feel passionately about. And both of us, you know, agree with the historicity of the Bible. So, you know, my first thought was that maybe I should carefully expound about this issue of the light from distant stars and so on. You know, how can light possibly get to us from a young universe? And I do welcome the opportunity later on in the dialogue to correct some of the misunderstandings as far as CMI's position in particular is concerned. And I was going to refer to the work of my friend and colleague, Dr. John Hartnett, who's a research professor of physics at the University of Adelaide, formerly University of Western Australia, speaks for CMI. You see, I'm just a medical doctor, so I've got no choice but to name drop a bit here. And he has done a fair bit of work on this whole issue of time dilation, and it's really not what he's not saying is that, you know, clocks are running differently now, but the very thing that you were just told about, that the universe does seem to have expanded, allows one to have a model which works on the well-attested scientific fact that gravity does distort time, and this has been tested in GPS satellites, and clocks sort of run faster by 38 microseconds a day out there in space, and if not corrected for, our GPS location would drift by 400 meters per hour. So that's a very real effect. But rather than try to defend that as a non-physicist, you can check that out in John's book. And he's got all the technical stuff at the back, and it's carefully explained to the layman. Or I could have gone to my colleague, Dr. Don Batten, who's written an article about 101 evidences and arguments for a young age of the world, but you can read that yourself on the website as well. I could have talked about the fact that there's been sensational discoveries of soft tissue in dinosaur bones. I'm talking not just soft, stretchy ligaments, but, transparent branching blood vessels with an ooze inside of them that can still be squeezed out like toothpaste. And under the microscope, nucleated red blood cells, plus the identification of proteins such as collagen, actin, tubulin, and more recently and more sensationally, DNA. Undoubted dinosaur DNA. This is all in the secular scientific journals. And Dr. Mary Schweitzer, the lead scientist and an evolutionist, she said, when you think about it, the laws of chemistry and biology and everything else that we know say that it should be gone. It should be degraded completely. I was contemplating talking about some of the large-scale sedimentary formations you see where there's absolutely no analogue in today's world. This idea that a river laying down sandstone gently, each year as it does today, and occasionally in flood, given millions of years stretched into the future, could give you the sort of formations that you see in the geologic record. You've got, in the Grand Canyon region, you've got the Coconina Sandstone, which is dead flat and covers 500,000 square kilometres of the continental United States. There's nothing happening on Earth today which, no matter how many millions of years you give it, will end up with something like that. Even more interesting is a type of rock called conglomerate. There's the Sheena Rump conglomerate also in the Grand Canyon region, which extends over the entire 260,000 square kilometres, and it's again dead flat. And conglomerate is a type of rock that only happens in today's world when it's in flood, because that's the only time that moving water has enough energy to make conglomerate, because conglomerate consists of boulders that have been picked up and transported and dumped and buried together and cemented. And in fact, in Australia, we have an entire mountain range made of this stuff, the Olgas or Catajuta. And that's the size of the sort of boulders that there are. And from top to bottom, there's our geologist, Dr. Taz Walker, right up to the top of this mountain range. And also seismic profiling shows kilometres deep underground, the same formation, the same stuff, unsorted conglomerate. The energy of moving water that would be required to the amount and the height of moving water to deposit this sort of thing is incredible. You've got the soft sediment deformation. You've got big slabs of the Grand Canyon at the Kaibab upwarp where you've got a sandwich of lots of layers, which the bottom one is supposed to be 300 million years different in age from the top one, but they've all obviously been bent together and they're not cracked. Rocks don't bend, they break as a rule, and so that indicates that the rocks couldn't have been hardened yet, and of course 300 million years is plenty of time to harden. Or I could have mentioned a man who's spoken for us occasionally. He's a world pioneer of gene engineering, former Cornell University professor John Sanford, was an evolutionist, and the scientific evidence in his field convinced him not just to be a creationist, but a biblical young earth Noah's flood creationist, because he's shown that the evidence that we have today of the huge rate at which mutations are building up in all living things higher than bacteria, like when I went to uni, every newborn baby was said to have one new mutation. Nowadays, the rate is at least 60. Most people say 100, and some are up to 300. They're accumulating so rapidly that, as Sanford says, all higher genomes must clearly degenerate. This is powerful evidence that life and mankind must be young. That means all populations of living things higher than bacteria would be extinct if they were older than just 100,000 years, and that's in his book, Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome. But if I was to sort of focus on that, then I would be talking science, and science is a wonderful, exciting thing, particularly the sort of science based upon the laws of physics. And you've heard that, sort of, I think, perhaps had the impression that we think that the laws of physics are just changing all over the place. Well, that's not so. And in fact, the whole inflationary scenario of the alleged Big Bang depends upon all sorts of things happening. For example, what starts the inflation going? It's alleged to be a reversal of the laws of gravity. What stops it? For some reason, they flip back again. It's like having a miracle from the secular perspective without a miracle worker. But I'm talking the sort of science that we love and respect, operational, experimental science, operating in the present, observable, repeatable, on how the world works, and the sorts of things that people speculate about in geology, for example, is based upon a different sort of science. It's based upon telling a story about the past, which is essentially unobservable, unrepeatable. Call it forensic science, if you like, where you can come to different conclusions on the same evidence. And even the light in our telescopes, for example, is being received right now. You know, philosophers of science have long recognized that this is not an area, origins, where you can prove or disprove things ultimately. You can come to some level of credibility, but even an Australian science educator said that the Genesis account of creation may even be the correct one, and he's talking about a straightforward Genesis, but there's no way science can prove or disprove that, and the creationists know it. You see, what I'd like to focus on is that for us, the recency of creation isn't a starting position with which we come to the Bible. Like, for example, because of radiometric dating, or because of this, or because of that, I have to, interpret Genesis this way. Rather, for us, it's always been an outcome, a logical deduction from what we claim are the very clear teachings of the Bible. So for us, the issue is, is it even possible for Genesis to be adapted to fit this popular scheme of long ages? Now, I tell you, it would make life really simple if it could. When I was an atheist all the way through university, it was mostly this issue of the long geological ages. And when people tried to witness to me, I was totally immune to all these ideas of long ages and so on, because I'd read the Bible. I'd read lots of religious books, I'd read the Bible carefully, and to me it was so obvious. We have a saying in Australia, blind Freddy can see something. And you can ask just about any 10-year-old and they'll give you an understanding of what the Bible teaches about in Genesis, which is something like this, that the writers of Genesis 1 to 11 intended to convey to their readers the ideas that creation was in 6 days, just like the Earth rotation days we now experience. The figures in the genealogies, you just add them up. And by the way, those genealogies in Genesis are watertight, because, you can say maybe that there's a grandson or a great-grandson in mind, but it actually tells you how old the ancestor was at the time that the descendant was born. So you're talking about something like 6,000 years ago, not even less than 10. And thirdly, that Noah's flood covered the whole world and wiped out everything outside the ark. And who actually said that? It was Professor James Barr, Regius Professor of Hebrew at Oxford University. And what's interesting is, unlike Hugh and myself, he doesn't believe that Genesis is actual history, so that makes him a useful, hostile witness. He's not trying to harmonise his understanding of, science and the Bible. But the important thing is, it wasn't only his own opinion. He claimed that probably, so far as I know, there is no professor of Hebrew or Old Testament at any world-class university who doesn't believe that. And you know, that's not even to mention the fourth commandment written by the finger of God in tablets of stone. Yeah, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. And then why should you do that? For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth. I want to quote from an author here, so this isn't original, but he says this. He says, in these passages it's explicit that the creation days were the same length as those of the human work week. There is no point even trying to understand the Bible if a word in the same passage and same grammatical context can switch meanings without any hint in the text itself. You see, looking at it historically, it's no wonder that before long ageism became popular, which was before Darwin at the time of the so-called Enlightenment, that evangelical commentaries, although they fought among each other and argued about all sorts of different things, but they never once seemed to argue about the length of the days or the age of the earth because it was so straightforward. I mean, even the Westminster Confession didn't bother to define what the space of 6 days was because it was so straightforward. And people knew, for instance, various authorities, pre-1830, okay, before long ageism became the popular fashion. And this is a listing of the dates BC. And you see, you're talking not just Christian sources, but also Jewish sources. You know, the Orthodox Jewish calendar has this year as the year 5,774 since creation. Even the Encyclopedia Britannica in the first edition in 1768 made its opinion straightforward that the creation of the world was in the year 4007 BC. And even the fathers of modern science. Now, you know, I was perplexed about the Isaac Newton thing because I actually looked up to confirm Newton's position on the age of the earth, regardless of what he might have said about one day of creation, but he believed the earth was about 6,000 years old. And that was just 24 hours ago. I looked that up. Now, you know, people like him, they looked around and they saw an ancient earth, absolutely no doubt about that. A world that was 60 long centuries old, which used to be thought of as a long period of time. But something changed. And what actually changed historically? Evolutionist Harvard professor Stephen Jay Gould talks about the way in which a man called Charles Lyell imposed a philosophy on geology. He said Lyell was a lawyer by profession, used cunning to establish his views. In fact, he says the catastrophists, the Noah's flood geologists of the time, were much more empirically, that means observationally, experimentally minded than Lyell, that Lyell imposed his imagination upon the evidence, and the idea was that the only processes that were allowed were slow and gradual ones, and there was no such thing as the flood. He rejected it, and in fact, he wrote in his private correspondence that his aim was to free the science of geology from Moses. So that's what, you know, well before radioactivity was discovered, long before radiometric dating, the whole concept of the millions of years was all in place based upon the extrapolation of this idea that the fossil-bearing layers that you find all over the earth, billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the world, were a tape recording of long ages. Now, here's the issue for us as Christians, that if that's true, if those fossils are millions of years old, then it's not just some little take it or leave it and how long do you think the days are. It's a lot more at stake, because in Genesis we read that God saw everything that he'd made and behold, it was very good. But those fossils record not just death, but suffering, violence in the animal kingdom, animals ripping each other apart. You can see the evidence of half-eaten bits of animal, lots of diseases, cancer, arthritis, bony tumours and all that. Now, is God saying that all of that is all very good? You know, in fact, you even remember how it says in Genesis that thorns were the consequence of the curse and the fall and Adam's sin. You find fossil thorns in the fossil record. Think what that does, the idea that thorns could not have been part of the curse. What does it do to the incredible symbolism of Jesus with the crown of thorns representing his death as the last Adam, that symbol of the curse, which will ultimately be overcome by Jesus Christ? You see, ultimately, what does that do to the nature of God? Because what answer does a Christian have apart from mumbling to the idea when people say, how could there be a God of love if there's all that death, pain and suffering in the world? There's always been a straightforward answer. Historically, the answer was, hey, death is not God's normality. God did not make a world that was bleeding and dying and suffering and full of cruelty. He made a world which really was all very good, and something happened. The first man, Adam, sinned, and the creation was cursed. You know, that was such a straightforward big picture. I call it the gospel big picture because that's why we're passionate about this, because the whole sin-death nexus, Genesis, is about the entry of sin and death into the universe and what it did to the world. The gospel, if it's about anything, is about God's solution to those twin problems of death and sin. You know, think about this. What if God judges the world because of his holiness and his hatred of sin with all of these bad things? That's one thing. But for God to sit there happily for hundreds of millions of years while things are torturing and bleeding and dying and so on, and say it's all very good, that's a totally different picture. And that's what, you know, made me feel very secure as an atheist, that, you know, the gospel was absolutely undermined by this long geological age system. In fact, Paul in the New Testament refers to death not as something that God thinks is great, but as the last enemy. In fact, in Romans chapter 8, it's so plain that Paul, I think, assumes that you've read the first part of the Bible and that you understand what he's talking about when he says in chapter 8 that the creation was subjected to futility, that in the future it's going to be set free from its bondage to decay in which it's been groaning together until now, because that's the effect of the Genesis curse upon the world. In fact, as Christians, we probably disagree on lots of things about the future, but we all agree that there's a time coming when there'll be no more death. Why? Because we believe those straightforward words in the book of Revelation. There shall be no more death. But a few verses further on it says why that is, because it says there shall be no more curse. That's talking about the Genesis curse. Now you see, I want to be compassionate here, because if one is really feeling forced to adopt the long-age wisdom of the day, then the way to go here would be to say, well, all of this, because some of these verses do only refer to human death. Maybe all of that suffering has only got to do with human death. Maybe the animals were bleeding and dying and all that sort of thing, but people were somehow immune from all that. There's all that cancer, all that disease, all those infectious bacteria that today affect, you know, some of them people and animals and so on, but no, that was just the animals. But you see, again, the near-universal understanding of the church was that there was no such pain and carnivory and animals ripping each other's throats apart in that original world. And they took seriously when it said in Genesis chapter 1, verses 29 and 30, that every living thing has been given every green herb. You see, without that understanding, it makes no sense when God then later on says to Noah in chapter 9, verse 3, just as I gave you every green herb, now I give you every living thing that moves. So previously, you, like every other creature, was limited to a vegetarian diet. Now you can also expand that diet. You know, biblical allusions to the future restoration are repeatedly of peace and lack of carnivory in the animal kingdom, consistent with a restoration of those Edenic conditions. And, you know, just as an aside, the words of Jesus, you know, when he says in Mark 10:6, but from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Think about this. If creation was this interminably long creation process, then people really only appear at the end of creation. And here's Jesus himself saying that. This is so, it's one of those many things that have to be explained away. I'm not saying there are no answers to these, but what I'm saying is that each one of them individually has to be explained away to fit a pre-existing model that the universe and the world is billions of years old, which is not the impression you get from the Bible. I was speaking to a theistic evolutionist, an academic in Melbourne. He was the head of an organisation of these long-age theistic evolutionists, and Hugh is not a theistic evolutionist, I'm very glad to say. But this guy was going to seminaries and so on and saying, yes, you can believe all these things and be a great Christian and so on. And I said to him in a cup of tea chat that we had, I said, what about this verse? Isn't it obvious that Jesus believed in a young world? And he said, I agree with you. And that really shocked me. And I said, well, what do you do with that? And he said, well, it's obvious. Jesus didn't know as much science as we did. And I thought, wow, where does that leave? Now, that's a theistic evolutionist, and I'm not sort of saying that that's anything to do with Hugh. But what I'm saying is that even though it would have been easier for him to find some explanation for this verse, see, it's almost like an aside. It's like a casual thing. It's not, Jesus is not specifically seeking to teach the age of the universe. But there's several places in the New Testament where Paul and Jesus make it plain. For instance, when Jesus refers to the blood of all the prophets shed from the foundation of the world, the blood of Abel and so on. And then there's the sequence of events. It's easy to say, Big Bang must be God's method of creating and so on. But the Big Bang involves a sequence of events. It involves the Earth appearing millions of years after the sun, whereas Genesis has it appearing before the sun. So what do you have to do? Again, you have to explain away the plain meaning about, how maybe it just appeared. Even if, that the sun was there all along, but to the earth it just appeared, even though there's plenty of Hebrew words that God could have used to say appeared. By the way, one thing I found staggering was that the suggestion that there's only one word in Hebrew for long ages, and that's the word yom. In fact, that's refuting compromise. The book I'll be mentioning about at the end, which is a definitive theological and scientific defense of straightforward Genesis, on page 323 has over 11 different ways of saying long ages and long periods of time, if that's what you want to do. Here's just a list from our Creation Answers book of some of the contradictions in that sequence. Again, there's that explaining away pressure, and I'm not saying that without compassion. What I'm saying is it all depends on your starting point in this. For instance, this whole thing about death and cancer before sin versus the gospel big picture, you can't resolve that with hand-waving about how plants die, for example. It's clear from the Bible that plants were never nefesh chaya, or living creatures, in the first place. They can't suffer. The goodness of God isn't under threat if Adam chomps into a carrot and so on. The big issue, once more, is that virtually no one saw these meanings in the Bible before long ageism. So it makes me think, and it made me think as an atheist, that if I'm supposed to accept this, then that means that God must have seriously misled Christians and Jews for about 2,000 years before the high priests of the Enlightenment. Also, there is another issue, and that is that if you accept that as the record of millions of years, then you cannot accept Noah's flood as global, covering the whole world, because by definition it would rework any such evidence for millions of years. So that means that all consistent long-age positions must teach a global flood, irrespective of what the text says. You know, but the whole idea of a mountain-covering flood that only covered the Middle East and yet just happened to wipe out all people in the world, you know, and you know, why would birds have to go on board? You know, birds just have to flap across to the nearest mountain range. Why do they have to get on a boat for a whole year? I mean, the whole story. Even Hollywood gets it, that Noah's flood was global. The text is so plain and straightforward. So that's why I maintain that these are serious big picture issues. You know, I respect people's right to hold different views, but I think we need to fully understand what the consequences of those views are to the average person. Now, some people say, well, I couldn't have believed in the gospel if I had to believe in a young world and so on. But you know what? At the end of the day, truth matters. And how do you define truth except by Jesus Christ, who is the truth, who knows all things and who doesn't lie in his word? And there's another issue, and that is that some of those fossils are actually, you know, before the biblical dates of Adam and Eve, are actually fossils of what appear to be humans. Certainly scientists, secular scientists, believe they're human fossils. Now, this is RTB's position on the creation date of Adam and Eve in 1997, about 10 to 25,000 years ago, more recently about 10 to 60,000 years ago. But the problem is that that's not old enough for Neanderthals. So Neanderthals have to be before Adam and Eve, which means, again, regardless of how human they might appear to be, they have to be regarded as some sort of non-human, soulless beasts of some sort. Then you've got the problem of all of those things that have been found affirming the humanity of Neanderthals. You know, stone tools, controlled fire use, jewellery, burying their dead with ornaments, musical instruments including on a pentatonic scale, compassion, evidence of timber-framed, skin-clad dwellings, and recently detailed hyoid bone analysis indicating that they could speak. This is not done by creationists, and more seriously for this view is recent evidence from DNA that they interbred with moderns. Now, because in this scheme they can't be human, what's left is to say, well, people must have had sex with animals. That's serious. You know, however, people might have sex with animals, perish the thought, but you don't go having babies with them. You know, it doesn't sort of go anywhere. Biblically, interbreeding with moderns makes them the same created kind. Scientifically, it makes them the same species. Folks, my heritage is from continental Europe, which means I'm almost certainly carrying some Neanderthal genes, and I reckon I'm on very safe scientific and biblical grounds in saying that the Neanderthal genes I carry are human genes. But it's not just Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, it's also Homo sapiens sapiens, the Homo 1 skull, which has been stated to be, quote, essentially modern Homo sapiens, was recently redated by methods that long-age people have endorsed, argon dating methods, as 195,000 years. So again, you know, there have to be arguments about there's another skull found next to it that has some robust features, but you know what? So do the ancestors in their graves of some of the modern day Aboriginals have robust features. Are they spiritless hominids? Obviously not. And obviously no one in this room would believe that. You know, I have pretty well run out of things to say in this first session, but let me just say that I hope that at the very least, you know, you will have been inspired to carefully check the arguments from both a biblical and a scientific perspective, because they are actually a lot more powerful than you might have been led to believe. And I would suggest, if you're looking for one single book, this, Refuting Compromise, it's blunt speaking, but it's accurate, and it's the most comprehensive and powerful theological and scientific defense of straightforward Genesis in existence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wieland. Well, we're going to invite Dr. Hugh Ross to come back up to the platform and to take a seat. Just as they're preparing themselves, I wonder if you've got a question. If you have, then take a couple of moments now to text that question. In the meantime, we're going to invite Dr. Ross and Dr. Wieland to have a conversation with one another. I'm just looking at my watch. It seems we want to be into the audience questions by 9 o'clock. So we've got about, I don't know, 17 or 18 minutes. So that's about 8 minutes each. So, Dr. Ross, we might start with you asking the question. And if you've got a burning question you'd like to ask Carl Wieland, then go ahead. I'll give you a couple of minutes warning with the bell. Sure. And in 8 minutes' time, we'll switch sides. Thank you.
Well, what I noticed, Carl, is you made the claim that scientists have no capability of measuring past events. And, I'm an astronomer. We don't get any data from the present. Everything we see is from the past. And do you acknowledge in astronomy we are directly witnessing past events?
Could I just have a microphone? Sorry.
There's one right here, actually.
Is that one still going?
Does that work? Testing. No. Could I have that? I'll put this one on.
It's probably not on.
The comments were perhaps directly relevant to geology, and I think I very hastily made a comment to that effect, and I think I mumbled something about the light that comes into our telescopes, because I'm aware of that point that you make, that light actually left the star at a time in the past. And may I say that we don't support the idea of an infinite light speed, or we don't support the idea of light, although we got excited about it for a while, about 20 years ago, that light might have travelled faster in the past, which some Big Bangers are now saying might solve some of the problems for the Big Bang. So yes, in a limited sense, you can, but you can't do experiments on the cosmos. You can't repeat the observation. You can only interpret the light that's coming into your telescope right now. So that light doesn't tell you, for example, that the time along the path of its journey was dilated due to a divine inflation of the cosmos, for example. So it's not quite as simple as, yes, we're directly observing the past, but generally your point's taken.
Right. Well, I do agree with you that in geology we're inferring the past, but in astronomy we're directly witnessing the past. And in fact, what's wonderful about astronomy is we can actually watch the universe being created. But that's one reason why we astronomers are persuaded the universe indeed must be billions of years old, because we're actually directly witnessing past events. So in that sense, I don't think there's a difference between operations science and historical science. It's a continuum.
It is a continuum. I'm not sure if they're out there on the... Sorry. I'm not sure if they're out there on the table, but Dr. Hartnett has a fascinating lecture showing how, due to this time dilation effect, we may actually be witnessing the events of creation on day 4 right now. But he's talking about a young world.
Right. You are aware we interviewed Dr. Hartnett on our website. It's actually posted, the entire interview, where we discussed this gravitational time dilation. And you are aware that his model needs incredibly condensed mass in order to get the dilation, which is something we astronomers don't observe.
Well, I'm definitely no physicist, but I know that John is very open-minded about his model and very keen and willing to consider alternatives and problems, and so he's, not saying this is definitely the way it happened, but what it does do is to tell me anyway, that if I didn't know, and I didn't have any idea how it could possibly have happened, that God could have created a universe that was both very large and very young, that I would hate to meet and sort of say to him, John, God, I didn't take... Let's try. Thanks. God, I didn't take your word at its very plain, straightforward meaning, just because I wasn't smart enough to work out how you could have been smart enough to do that. And in fact, what's interesting is that with things like relativity and quantum physics, we're finding some astonishingly exotic explanations, including for that horizon light travel time problem that you mentioned, and including, and I suppose you're aware too, that there are changes postulated in the laws of physics. So to say we don't change the laws of physics, well, I mean,
what we are talking about are laws of physics we haven't discovered yet, but we're not saying any of the laws of physics have changed. And in that sense, we are verifying that the Bible got it right when it said the laws of physics don't change.
Well, we actually believe also that the laws of physics don't change unless you have a miracle-working God. But in fact, Professor Paul Davies, whom you quoted in a private discussion earlier, nothing confidential, but you're obviously aware of the man, has actually published, and we've written about it on our website, about his belief that the laws of physics themselves have evolved.
Well, clearly there are atheist physicists who are speculating about the changes in the laws of physics in order to bypass the God of the Bible. That's not our position at Reasons to Believe. And there are no measurements that demonstrate that there's any change in the laws of physics, quite the opposite. We have measurements showing no change in the laws of physics any greater than 1 part in 100 quadrillion per million years, or per year actually. So in that sense, I feel the Bible's been fully vindicated, no change in the laws of physics. But as I mentioned, if there's no change in the laws of physics, there's no possibility for a young Earth model.
Yeah, I don't agree with you. And
well, you'd be the first young Earth creations I've met that would make that claim.
Well, we've got about 10 or 11 PhD scientists working for us globally that would, I believe, support me in that. I'm not sure who you've been knocking around with.
Well, I've read your website. I mean, what I'm seeing them saying is exactly the same thing I'm getting from all other younger scientists, that their model critically depends on radically changed laws of physics, either at the fall or the flood or both.
Now, you're talking about one aspect, which is the rate model of accelerated radiometric decay, and we're certainly not hanging all of our eggs into that basket. And so to say that, therefore, the entire young Earth creation model depends upon some definite radical change in the laws of physics, no, that's not the case.
Well, that's actually been conceded by your peers.
Well, who are my peers in this? Give me some names.
Well, all the scientists who were part of the RATE project. And it's not just radiometric decay. I mean, if you don't have radiometric decay constants changing, you have to have other constants changing. Some constant has to change in order for the universe to be only thousands of years old.
Now when you say peers, you're talking about the creation movement as a whole. To be fair, I specifically, just as you specifically referred to RTB scientists, I specifically referred to CMI scientists. So they certainly...
Well, if you've got a CMA scientist that's saying any differently, I'd like to see it. Because again, I've read your website.
The question is not whether they say different, but I could turn it around and say, show me, I mean, I'm their boss. I know what they're saying. I read the website. And they just don't make those sort of comments. And equally, anyway, I won't go on and on because people can read the websites for themselves.
Okay. Yeah, you made a comment about the flood being worldwide, which, by the way, is something I've fully endorsed, that the Bible teaches a worldwide flood. But what I notice is that the Bible frequently deals with worldwide events that don't cover the entire globe. And in particular, what do you do with the texts in Psalms and Job and Proverbs that tell us once continents are in place, water will never again cover the whole face of the earth? I certainly agree it could wipe out the entire world of humanity. 2 Peter 2, the world of the ungodly was flooded. But do you acknowledge that there are passages in the Bible that would rule out the possibility of a global flood?
No, if you're talking about Psalm 104, it talks about God making a promise, the rainbow promise, that the waters in the current sea will never again turn to cover the earth. I don't see what that's got to do with the continents being in place.
It's in the context of Creation Day 3. Creation Day 3, God makes continents, and from that point forward, water will never again cover the whole face of the earth. And it's not just Psalm 104. I can name 5 texts that make the same claim.
But that's, respectfully, that's like me saying, you know, I can give you 10 verses that say this and say that, but the reality is, just so it's very clear, that you're saying that the flood did not cover the whole globe, and yet somehow it wiped out all of humanity.
Correct.
So did they all come and migrate to the Middle East to get wiped out?
Well, what you see in Genesis is that humanity was in one locale, and then you got, even after the flood, humanity still refusing to multiply and fill the earth. And so God has to forcibly scatter humanity over the face of the earth. That's Genesis 10, which talks about this great migration. And this is something that's actually confirmed by DNA evidence, which shows indeed there was an early, very aggressive migration of humanity from one locale to the whole earth. But I hear the bell ring.
So yes, now, Carl, it's your turn to ask the questions too.
Okay, so what would you do then? What would you see as your approximate time for the flood?
Approximate time for the flood, I would put it somewhere in the last ice age, probably in the neighborhood of 40,000 plus or minus 20,000 years ago, which would fit with the idea that the 4 rivers mentioned in Genesis 2 come together in one location, which requires all 4 rivers to be flowing.
And the fact that the only time I can read about in the Bible where it actually talks about people staying together and not dispersing across the earth was at Babel, which was after the flood. That
Right.
doesn't bother you?
No, not at all. I see humanity as being commanded by God to multiply and fill the earth. Adam's descendants did not obey that command. God brought the flood, and then after the flood, humanity was still resistant in their following God's command to multiply and fill the earth, so God had to forcibly scatter them.
Thank you for the clarification. Can I ask you, because you talked about hapa'am in the Hebrew, where God said, Adam said, at last. It's one translation. Leopold says it means now at length. And the question is, first of all, how long is a piece of string? He might have been very happy after God's bringing the woman to him after naming all the animals, but I suggest there's nothing in the text that it's more than a day. But let me just give you other biblical references in which hapa'am is used and has nothing to do with saying, as you very assuredly did, that it definitely means the days are long periods of time. In Judges 6:39, Gideon says to God, "May I speak once more? Let me make a test once more." Now, each time, the once more is the translation of hapa'am, but the second test is only 24 hours after his first test, and there is another in Genesis 18. But doesn't that bother you?
Well, I actually went to a number of Hebrew scholars on this who have done an extensive study on hapa'am as it's used throughout the Old Testament. And they says, yeah, this is the most common translation, that it's at long last, or at once, or finally, this is taking place. And I can understand that one verse where it's saying finally, it could actually be a relatively short period of time. But what you see in Genesis chapter 2 is obviously a progression of considerable time before you got Adam saying hapa'am. The trees are growing, you got him naming all the animals, he goes through surgery. So I think there's plenty within the text that tells us this can't be as brief as a few seconds at the end of a 24-hour day.
We've never claimed it's a few seconds, but
plus much more than 24 hours.
I don't agree, and that's been carefully analysed on our site by Russell Gregg. But just a question I have of you. There are 2 people, the long age view for the conservative Christian is very attractive. Is there a way I can do this without, therefore I don't have to be scientifically embarrassed, and at the same time I can be a non-evolutionist, I can be a conservative Christian. So you're probably aware that the evangelical apologist Norman Geisler is supportive of your long age views, and Chuck Colson also. Yet both of them, in response to the issue of natural evil and suffering, have clearly indicated, without understanding or realising the inconsistency, that the original creation could not have included animal disease and suffering, and that these were a consequence of Adam's sin affecting the whole creation. Colson for example, in the book co-authored with Nancy Pierce, he said the consequences of sin affect the very order of the universe itself. The fall affects all of nature. Every part of God's handiwork was marred by the human mutiny.
Well, what I see there is a presumption that Adam is the first sinner. The Bible's clear that he is not the first sinner, it's Satan. And the scripture is silent as to when Satan actually rebelled against God. I mean, clearly it was before Adam and Eve's rebellion, and it could have actually been before the creation of the universe itself. And so what I notice is you've got passages like 2 Timothy 1:9. The grace of God was put in effect before the beginning of time, which tells me that God had sin and evil in mind before he even created the universe. And when it says it's a very good creation, it's the best possible creation as a tool in God's hands to eliminate evil and suffering once and for all. And maybe this is a place where we differ, because I know other young earth creations I've talked to have this view that the final state of redeemed humanity will be a restored earth, whereas we take the position it's going to be a radically different creation with different laws of physics, different dimensionality even, that God's going to replace this earth. And I'm just curious as to where you stand on that.
We stand on a restoration because, even in the book of Acts, it talks about the times of restoration of all things. And there are so many allusions to a restoration of Edenic conditions. Can I, though, before our time runs out, say I can understand why in defending long ageism it's crucial to have, if you could demonstrate, for instance, that plants could suffer because obviously Adam could, chomp into a carrot and it would die, but it would destroy the whole creationist argument about death and suffering and so on. Do you still stand by this quote from Creation and Time, page 63, that says, "But even plants suffer when they're eaten. They experience bleeding, bruising, scarring, and death. Why is the suffering of plants acceptable and not that of animals? Given that," this is me talking now, "given that plants don't have a nervous system capable of registering pain or emotion, how can they suffer?"
Well, they certainly do experience deleterious consequences. And my point in that article I wrote 25 years ago is that there's a gradation in the kind of consequences that plants and animals experience. So we human beings clearly suffer more than, say, lions and cats. And they suffer more than frogs, and frogs suffer more than insects, and insects suffer more than plants. There's a gradation all the way down the line. And so maybe what you're doing is taking a very narrow definition of suffering, where I intended a much broader definition of suffering.
How's our time going, Mr. Chairman? Okay, well, perhaps I'll just end with a semi-humorous note, meant in friendliness, but we've got some royals visiting right now, and the father of Prince William was renowned for talking to plants, so maybe they can suffer after all.
Thank you. Well, we have a number of questions that have been texted in, and I'll address the first one to you, Dr. Ross. I think the way we'll do this is I'll ask the question, you'll have about 3 minutes to respond. I'll give a tinkle, and that means time's up, and then we'll allow Dr. Wieland to respond to the question as well for 1 minute, and then we'll reverse the procedure. So, first question, addressed to Hugh Ross. If the Earth is very old and dinosaurs millions of years old and humans relatively young, what happens to the implications of original sin and the fall of humanity? The T-Rex has huge teeth, implying killing and death millions of years before humanity existed. Does this mean death existed before the fall of humanity?
Yeah, Romans 5:12 is quite clear that it was Adam's sin that brought about the death of humanity. It says, death through sin was visited upon all men. Now, if it meant all life, you would expect Paul to say, death came to all life, but instead he says, death came to all men. So he's being very careful to only include humans in his declaration that the death of Adam, or the sin of Adam, brought about all death. And what we see in Psalm 104, it's the property of all life to die off, but God recreates and renews the face of the earth. And it's that process of death and recreation that enables the crust of the earth to be built up with over 76 quadrillion tons of biodeposits. And because of these billions of years of the accumulation of life and death and the resultant biodeposits, we're able to launch and sustain global high technology civilization. If we didn't have those 76 quadrillion tons, we wouldn't be able to do what we've done, and we wouldn't be able to take the good news of Jesus Christ to all the people groups of the world in just centuries instead of billions of years. So in that sense, I would be young earth, and I believe that we can complete the Great Commission quickly, not in a long period of time. But it's thanks to all those plants and animals that lived before us and died before us that we have the resources we need to build cities like Perth. The city of Perth, for example, is about 99% biodeposits. Even the metals that we mine are there because of the existence of life that took the dilute metals and concentrated them into forms that we can mine. And I know Western Australia has a great mining industry. That wouldn't be the case if there wasn't billions of years of life that preceded us.
I would say it wouldn't be the case if there wasn't a worldwide flood that buried those billions of dead things, plants and animals and so on. And by the way, coal and oil can form very, very rapidly under very realistic conditions. Just sort of exclude the oxygen and heat them, and you can get coal forming in 3 weeks, for example.
But not that much. There's way too much coal and oil.
Well, there's actually an article on our website which does all that quantification.
Okay, I've got a question for Wieland. The question is, I'll do my best, eh? Why don't any non-Christian scientists agree with young Earth scientists?
Well, because the issue ultimately is about the interpretation of the evidence, and scientists did agree with young Earth creationists once upon a time, and I mentioned how the philosophy of interpretation changed, and that had nothing to do with the scientific observations or with the laws of physics or anything else. The whole paradigm, the whole way of thinking changed. You know, let me just give a quick anecdote. I was in a meeting once at a small Anglican church in Pakenham, Victoria, and the minister there, I didn't know this, he got up first and he said, "The reason I became interested in this subject is because I was an exploration geologist." He said one of my jobs was to find samples for the radiometric dating for the mining companies. And he said most of the time they'd say, "Go back and find another one, that one's no good." And one day he thought to ask them, "Why isn't it any good?" And they said, "Wrong date." In other words, if the dates disagree with what's already assumed to be the ballpark, and we've got quotes from evolutionist professors of geology confirming that. For instance, if you found a specimen from dinosaur rock that dated at 30 million years, then the 30 million years would be recalculated or discarded because the philosophy rules. So the paradigm is paramount, and this isn't a game of your scientists versus my scientists. It's ultimately, what does the Bible say, and is the Bible trustworthy?
Well, the point that was made, though, is that there are no scientists independent of a particular Bible interpretation that draw the conclusion that the earth or the universe are only thousands of years old. I mean, what I see in the young earth literature is there must be some pervasive deception. But keep in mind, many of us are people who believe in the biblical inerrancy of the Bible. And with respect to radiometric dating has its region where it works and its regions where it doesn't work. And therefore, what we do to try to date things is try to come up with multiple different radiometric tools that all are within a certain range of the half-life. And so, for example, with the most ancient rocks, you've got uranium-235 decay, 238 decay, and thorium-232 decay that all decay into 3 different isotopes of lead, where all of that lead only comes from radiometric decay. What that does is give you 6 independent tools for dating the age of the rock, and what you notice is all 6 methods that give you the same date to 5 places of the decimal.
Okay, I've got another question now for Dr. Ross. When it comes to the Big Bang, you're very confident to the precision of scientific aging, the book of nature. However, when it comes to the straightforward revelation propositions of Scripture, God's Word, you're willing to dispute them. God's Word tells us Jesus rose from the dead, yet science tells us that dead people do not rise, nor do virgins give birth. Do you acknowledge that science is a fallible authority relative to God's infallible Word, the Scriptures, or the Bible?
Well, we're making a distinction here between science and theology. You need to realize theology is not the same as the words of the Bible. It's our interpretation of the words of the Bible. And science is not the same as the record of nature. It's our interpretation of the record of nature. And so when science and theology conflict, that means we've made some misunderstanding, misinterpretation, or we lack knowledge of one revelation or the other. And it's incumbent upon us to study more of the science and theology to eliminate those anomalies and to get a consistent picture. I see nothing in the Bible that would contradict the interpretation these days or long periods of time. In fact, I see an overwhelming case in the Bible that indeed these days must be long periods of time. And hey, I came at the Bible 8 years before I met a Christian. It's because I was raised in Canada. And what I noticed there is that a straightforward reading of the text implied these days had to be long periods of time. So again, it's not a debate between a forced interpretation of Scripture and a straightforward interpretation. The straightforward interpretation persuaded me these had to be long periods of time. And again, from what I already mentioned, there's no evening and morning for the seventh day. The word Yom is referred to the entire creation week. And look all that happens on creation day 6. So the 6th day and the 7th day are long time periods. And I wrote this book, A Matter of Days, where I lay out 21 biblical reasons why these days have to be long periods of time. And to put it in one sense, it's not enough to look at one book of the Bible. We need to look at all 66 books of the Bible. It's not enough to take the Bible literally. We have to take it literally and consistently, because one book of the Bible can't contradict another book of the Bible. Neither can the book of nature ever contradict the book of Scripture.
We would totally agree that the Bible doesn't contradict itself, and one of the big problems I have, with due respect, is the massive inconsistencies in the long age position. As I said, it would be much easier. Certainly life would be simpler. But let me just use the rest of my 1 minute to point out that I did actually mention a scientist who concluded on the basis of the evidence a young age, and he was a top Cornell professor and a pioneer of gene engineering, John Sanford. Of course, he now holds to a biblical position. He actually changed his mind, and he's not the only one who's changed his mind on the basis of the evidence.
But also on the basis of Scripture.
No, he didn't. He
actually lectured us at our office, and that's what he told us.
Well, he lectured at our super camp, and he told us that it was the build-up of the mutations that made him not just a creationist, but a young Earth creationist.
Okay, I have another question for you, Dr. Wieland. Many of us work in the natural resources industries in Perth, or because Perth is a hub for the resource industry. In my 25 years in the industry, I've never encountered a single resource company that uses a young Earth position to explore for minerals, oil or gas. So my question is, if you have encountered such a company, and if so, how successful is this company's exploration strategy?
Well, first of all, it's, can I say, bizarre to expect that the finding of minerals has anything to do with one's philosophy of interpretation. Certainly, if somebody had the view that a massive sedimentary catastrophe had occurred and had washed things into huge basins, they might have some more success finding coal and oil. And in fact, Dr. Steve Austin, who used to work for the Institute for Creation Research, was an oil and gas exploration geologist, he certainly will tell you that the finding of coal, oil, for example, is where you find it. But what's interesting, once I was lecturing in the Cooper Basin of South Australia, and they said that there is a huge amount of coal sort of overlaying the oil beds. The geologists were telling me that. And it's just far too deep to mine economically. Perhaps now with fracking they will. But interesting thing is that if you look at what the Cooper Basin is, it's a massive sedimentary basin. It makes heaps of sense that huge amounts of vegetation were washed into that Cooper Basin and that they're now being converted into the oil and gas that's there. In fact, our government science agency, CSIRO, believes that the oil in Bass Strait comes from the Gippsland coal deposits on continental Victoria, which is being thrust under the sea, and from the chemical signature on that, it's actually turning into the oil right now. So I think there's an enormous amount of potential for finding coal and oil perhaps more successfully. In fact, continental drift has enabled people to make all sorts of predictions about finding coal and oil, and before someone jumps up and down about the millions of years, sorry, I wasn't referring to you, I mean anybody in their minds, let me say that one of the world's leading experts, acknowledged as such in New Scientist on plate tectonics, is Dr. John Baumgartner, who's lectured at our camps before, and holds the world's leading 3D supercomputer model of plate tectonics. And he's shown, by the way, that there is continental crust that has been thrust 700 kilometres deep into the Earth. Now, if that happened over millions of years, it should have equalised in temperature, but it hasn't equalised yet. It's still cool, you can tell that from seismic profiling, which means it hasn't been down there for millions of years, which means the whole plate tectonics thing happened catastrophically, almost certainly at the time of the flood.
Well, I think the point of the question was that there's a huge quantity of coal, oil, natural gas, and metal minerals in Australia alone that would be difficult to interpret in a young Earth context. Again, we can't get 76 quadrillion tons of biodeposits in just a few thousand years. I mean, just the flow of energy from the sun, even if you take all of that solar energy and 100% convert it into fossil fuels, it will not add up to the total quantity of fossil fuels, especially when you include the Clath rates. And this is one thing you can do. You can go to the NASA website and actually total up the entire quantity of fossil fuels and metal ores in the crust of the Earth. It's something we did in this book, Navigating Genesis, and it's literally hundreds of thousands of times beyond what's possible in the young Earth model. So I think that was the point of the question. And yeah, I have looked at John Baumgartner's model. It does critically depend on very radically altered laws of physics in order to get 8,000 miles of plate tectonics in just a year's time.
Okay, I have another question for you, Dr. Ross. Could you please explain your understanding of evolution? Do you accept that there is some measure of adaptation on micro level to the environment?
Well, I think this is something that both Carl and I agree upon, is that yes, we see in real time the evidence that there's adaptation within the species. So for example, our own species is considerably taller than it was 2,000 years ago, but we're still human beings. What's referred to as microevolution. Now, I think we disagree on the degree of microevolution. We take the position of reasons to believe that that microevolution is extremely limited in what it can do, whereas what I see in the young Earth creationist literature is that it's quite aggressive, capable of making millions of species from the few thousand on board Noah's Ark. We don't think microevolution can do that.
The millions of species, we do believe in speciation because it's an observed thing. I mean, if you have mongrel dogs that within the same amount of information in their genes were able to give rise to groups like, you know, Dalmatians and Great Danes and Chihuahuas and so on, each of those is a subset of the original gene pool. Now, in time, there's no reason why. In fact, some have even suggested that Chihuahuas and Great Danes might make different species because maybe they can't freely and naturally interbreed for obvious reasons. But be that as it may, if reproductive isolation is your definition of a species, then it's occurred, and it's occurring today. But you can show that just like with the mongrel dogs, just like, wolves have given rise to domestic dogs and mongrel dogs have given rise to dingoes and Great Danes, but you can't start from Chihuahuas and breed Great Danes. So Hugh and I would agree that evolution has to explain how to get massive amounts of new information. Otherwise you can't go from microbes to microbiologists, and the sort of changes that you see have to do with a large gene pool thinning out into smaller and smaller gene pools, but we would believe that can give rise to new species. And by the way, for those who are interested, Thomas Gold, G-O-L-D, look it up on the website, has some very strong evidence that at least some of the oil is not from biomass, but rather from bacterial action on inorganic compounds like methane.
Well, we would agree with that, but you can actually look at the isotopes and see how much is organic and how much is non-organic, and well over 90% is organic.
Yeah, well, given that only a modest fraction of all the stuff that's down there has been pulled up, and analysis of the isotopes hasn't been done on each one, I would say that's pushing a point. But even with the previous assumptions about the volume of biomass, if you look on our website, as I said earlier, you'll see an article, I think Shearer was one of the guys that wrote it.
I remember the article.
Where he calculates it all, and if you look at Shaven's evidence from petrified coal balls and so on, that the coal forests of the northern hemisphere, the so-called Gondwana coals, were actually almost certainly masses of floating vegetation. They have all the roots and all the other evidence of the same sort of things that floating plants have today. Then if you have the pre-flood oceans as part of the area to generate biomass, it's not such a big problem.
Well, Scherer underestimated the biodeposit mass by at least a factor of 10,000 times.
Well, that's
Again,
interesting.
it's documented on the NASA website.
Okay,
Well,
we have one final question for Dr. Wieland. How do you explain the entire sedimentary column, in places tens of kilometres thick, in a younger age position?
That's, I thought that was reasonably clear from the comment that I made, that if you've got a global flood, which by definition, I mean, if you look at the Lake Missoula flood, which is something that people now all accept happened, which was an ice age flood after Noah's flood, and huge amounts of water were dammed up, a lot more than in the Great Lakes of North America, and people have now largely accepted that the channeled scablands, an incredible amount of carving of the geological landscape through solid crystalline rock, happened from that huge release of water. Now, when you double the size of a flood, you don't just double the destructiveness. It goes up by an order of magnitude. No one can model, no one can conceive of what a global flood is capable of doing. We're talking about grinding up rock, we're talking about depositing, redepositing, we're talking about re-eroding, we're talking about cyclic sedimentation, where currents come in from different directions, overlapping. You see, in the Ruhr Valley in Germany, you have things called cyclothems, which is where you have the same pattern of sedimentary rocks like coal, sandstone, limestone, shale, coal, sandstone, limestone, shale, repeating. Now, if that happened 2 times, consider what it means in the long age model. It means that there was a forest, and then the land must have sunk and something else came in, and then limestone formed at the bottom of the sea, and then later on a forest grew again in the same spot. If that repeated 2 or 3 times, that would be massive coincidence. That would be really hard to explain. But in the Ruhr Valley, you have that happening up to 300 times. It's much easier to explain in terms of cyclic sedimentation. Sure, there are difficulties, there are challenges, there are problems for all sorts of models, but let me say that I've been privileged over the last 2 decades to see an enormous number of seemingly impossible problems where people said just as confidently as people are saying today about other things. They said, for instance, there's no way you can explain how these plutons, these big lumps of granite, could have cooled down in less than 1 million years. But if you start with the Word of God, and you're considering there's only just a handful of people researching this from that position, the fact that answers have been forthcoming and that's now no longer a problem, it's been solved in the secular papers, the secular journals themselves, has just been a privilege for me to see that. And so I'm prepared to say that regardless of outstanding problems, the Word of God is so overwhelmingly clear in the big picture. And I particularly point to this death and suffering and bloodshed and so on before Adam, that I'll stand with the global flood, which is the historic understanding of the Word of God.
Well, I do understand the young Earth model for the global flood and how you attempt to explain all that sedimentation, but it requires a model where you've got 6,000 to 8,000 miles of lateral plate tectonics and about 60,000 feet of vertical tectonics. And I come from Southern California. I know what it's like when the Earth moves 2 inches. And if you multiply that up by 6,000 miles in the space of 5 months, you literally evaporate all the water. There'd be no survivors on board the Ark. There'd be no Ark, period. And therefore, the problem with the global flood model, it's way too destructive. Yes, you can make all this geology happen, but it also means you have to have radiometric decay rates 1 billion times faster than what we measure today, and astronomical measurements clearly tell us that did not happen. And I would say the Bible tells us it didn't happen. The Bible's clear. The laws of physics don't change over the history of the universe. They will not change until God replaces his universe with a brand new creation, Revelation 21.
Well, I think our two speakers deserve a warm hand of thanks. I'd like to thank you both for the presentations that you have made, for the dialogue that you've carried on in front of us. Must be, in some respects, a little bit uncomfortable, and I appreciate the grace and the good humour and the expertise that you have brought this evening, and I'm sure everyone else is also appreciative. As you leave, well, actually, I'd like to thank you for your participation as well. And we're so glad that you were interested enough to come out tonight, and we very much hope that you've enjoyed the two presentations and the dialogue that has occurred. As you leave, please consider giving a gold coin donation, or even a more substantial one if you wish. There are some ushers back there, and I think as you process out of the hall, you can throw it in a bucket. I think that's the way it works. In the foyer, there are book tables, both for Creation Ministries International and for Reasons to Believe, and do feel very free to browse both those tables. And both Dr. Wieland and Dr. Ross have indicated that they'd be quite pleased to stay for a little bit. There is some other arrangements and travel that has to happen tomorrow, so they're not going to be here very late. But perhaps if you've got a book and you'd like them to sign it, I'm sure they'd be very pleased to do that. God bless you. Let me pray as you go. Merciful God, we thank you that you have given us your word. You've also given us a faith that seeks understanding. As we go forward and go forth from this place tonight, may our faith be enriched and strengthened. May our understanding deepen and grow. And may our love for Christ and for others deepen and grow also. We bless you and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you as you go.